This video is sponsored by Skillshare, an online community of creators, enthusiasts and experts offering video classes on a variety of topics. I'll talk about Skillshare at the end of the video, but you should know that there's a link in the description box that will give, for a limited time, the first 1,000 people to click on it, a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again, and the other day I was talking with my fiancé about possible reading suggestions, and very naturally, very spontaneously, I pointed out the brief Wondrous life of Oscar Wilde on our shelf and mentioned that it's quite possibly the best novel of all times, and the spontaneity with which I said that surprised myself in the first place. That's quite a bold statement for any single work of art, but I've been studying the novel for a very long time. I recently reread it in its entirety after basically rereading my favorite sections quite frequently over the course of the last few years, and I thought I would share my opinion on the novel with you and discuss it with you guys in the comments. The brief Wondrous life of Oscar Wilde is narrated by one of the most unique, most peculiar narrative voice you are going to encounter in your reading adventures. A Dominican-American man called Junior, who narrates the life of a Dominican family, the De Leon, who at one point in the 20th century moved to New York first, to New Jersey, to the United States, and who seem to be followed around by a curse, a so-called Fuku, which influences and ruins in various ways the lives of these people, the De Leon, with whom Junior, the narrator, has different relations in the course of his life. Most of the narrative follows the youngest member of the family, Oscar de Leon, later rather cruelly nicknamed Oscar Wilde, a young Dominican-American man who is very much into hardcore nerd culture, into role-playing games, comic books, fantasy and science fiction novels, who falls in love very easily and who is quite overweight. He is not especially pretty as a young man and doesn't have much success with the ladies, and the discrepancy between this stereotype of Dominican-American men as very sporty, Latin lovers who have no problem seducing young women, the discrepancy between that image and Oscar's personality and Oscar's looks is something that Junior remarks on extensively. It's something that comes to identify, to become one of the key features of Oscar himself. Oscar himself feels so sorry all his life because of how distant he is from this ideal. Is it even a positive ideal after all? Or from this idea anyway of the Dominican man. Although if Oscar is obsessed with it, Junior seems to be equally obsessed with Oscar's uncoolness and with Oscar's nerditude. There is something very interesting going on there, and the web of connections between the novel's characters and the unspoken attitudes that they show one another, they are what makes the novel brilliant and what makes it more stimulating and more interesting with every new rereading. Keeping it simple and talking about Junior and Oscar's relationship, they are roommates in college, they are supposedly friends. It's not quite clear how genuine the friendship is and how much Junior sees it more as a form of charity, because he is in love with, at the time he's in love with with Oscar's sister. Even more significantly though, Junior's embarrassment at Oscar's passion for all this uncool stuff, for anime and comic books and such, might be saying more about Junior himself than it says something about Oscar. Junior clearly is someone who also loves genre fiction and popular culture immensely, and he is familiar with it, is conversant in its language. He just hides it all, and at certain points in the novel he confesses his youthful passion for these things. But even beyond these moments where he admits to liking these same things that Oscar likes, even though he wouldn't admit it under torture, even more than there, this passion that Junior has, this passion for genres, emerges in the way the novel is narrated. The brief Wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, in narrating the story of the life of Oscar de Leon and of his family at large, refers to two main macro areas, we could say. The first one is the history of the Dominican Republic, especially in the 20th century, and the second one is the world of genre, to use, for lack of a better terms. And with this term, I include nerd culture, popular culture, science fiction, fantasy, horror, and so on and so forth. The difference there is that every time Junior refers to events from the history of the Dominican Republic, he refers to politicians, to torturers, to dictators. He always provides footnotes, literal footnotes in the novel, to explicate and to explain to his audience what he's talking about. Whereas every time he refers to popular culture, these references are left unexplained. For instance, in an early description of how attracted to young girls Oscar was when he was a 7-year-old boy, you should have seen him, his mother sighed, in her last days. He was our little Porfirio Rubirosa. All the other boys his age avoided the girls like they were a bad case of Captain Trips, not Oscar. The point is, I didn't know before reading the book who Porfirio Rubirosa is. Apparently a famous Dominican playboy and friend of the fascist Trujillo regime. But you get a very useful footnote explaining that, and you get quite a long paragraph about the history and the significance of Porfirio Rubirosa in Dominican culture. What you don't get is an explanation of what the hell Captain Trips is, which is the fictional disease from The Stand by Stephen King. In general, you kind of can assume what the narrative is talking about. It's a basic tenet of semiotics that every text you read kind of turns you into its model reader as you go along. You kind of figure it out as you're experiencing the narrative. You might not understand the specific significance of the reference to Captain Trips and the fact that Stephen King is one of Oscar's favorite writers, that he wants to become the Dominican Stephen King, or that infection, contagion, radiation sickness metaphors play a very important role in the narrative at large. You might not understand the significance of all this, but you will understand what the narrator is talking about. Other kids disliked girls, Oscar liked them. Elsewhere in the novel, a scheming character connected to the Trujillo regime is described as a shallop in a web, meaning the spider from Lord of the Rings. And then again, if you don't know who Shallop is, you'll still understand that that's a reference to something negative. It's a reference to something scheming and monstrous. What this constant accumulation of genre references does is build the story of the life of Oscar de Leon in precisely the way he would have appreciated as a dedicated and passionate fan of genre. The decision you have to make when you read Oscar Wilde is whether you're happy with just kind of coasting along and understanding the references on a superficial level, or whether you want to go deeper and research them and try and understand where they come from, maybe read some of the intertexts that are so relevant to Oscar. Dune by Frank Herbert is a novel he loves. Akira, the Japanese movie, he adored. Watchmen, the comic book, the graphic novel, he also loved, and so on and so forth. I am an immense nerd. I don't think that comes across extensively on the channel, but I do love nerdy pursuits to bits. And even I must confess, wasn't very familiar with a lot of the genre fiction and nerd culture that Oscar loved. Part of it might be geographic. Some nerd culture that was popular in the US didn't necessarily penetrate Europe. Some of it might be a matter of time. Oscar was an 70s and 80s nerd, whereas I was more of a 90s, 2000s nerdy kid. There is a passage in the book where Oscar and Junior kind of diss Magic the Gathering, which was one of the first nerdy pursuits I embarked on. But part of it is just the fact that, all of us go through lives by navigating reality using different works of art as our compass, and it's only natural that I'm not going to understand all of the references that were so relevant to Junior and to Oscar. Why is that decision, whether you want to research genre references or not, why is it important? Number one, if you if you understand the full artistic implications and if you full aesthetic implications of the extended webs of metaphors that are present in the novel, your appreciation of the novel will increase, and you'll have to trust me on that. I liked the book the first time I read it. I only fully understood its genius with every new rereading, and when I started unpacking some of these references and the way they're used and juxtaposed in the text. But even more significantly, and on a much more basic level, nobody's saying that you should spend 3 months reading a Oscar Wilde syllabus or anything of the sort. On a more important level, Oscar de Leon, the character, is described in the novel as somebody who was isolated and alienated all his life, who had to suffer terrible bullying and oceans of misery, because nobody else quite understood his passion and his commitment to genres, and nobody was really interested in the works of art he loved. Some people tolerated them, some people really hated them, but nobody was really interested in them enough to speak to him on his same terms. If, when you read the book, you're just contented with half understanding the references, you are doing what everybody else always did, and you are, sure, going along with Oscar's experience, you are reading the story of his life, but you're not really stepping into his own shoes. If, instead, when you read Oscar Wilde and when you reread it, you become a bit of a nerd yourself, and you start and you read some of those texts that Oscar loved, some of the novels and comic books that he adored, you are taking one step forward, and you are trying to truly see the world through the same lens that he saw it through. And by the way, this approach to the novel was first suggested to me by an academic article by T.S. Miller. I'm going to put a link in the description box to it. If you have read Oscar Wilde, I cannot possibly recommend that article enough. It is a very approachable work of criticism that's going to change the way you read the novel. It is, I believe, possibly the single most significant and relevant work of criticism on the novel existing so far. Oscar might be the protagonist, but large parts of the novel are dedicated to other members of his family, to his grandfather, to his sister, and most significantly to his mom, Belly. Belly is probably the most complex and definitely the most humane character in the novels. A cruel person, acts horribly toward her kids, especially toward their daughter Lola, lived a terrible, extremely difficult life, very hot-headed, somewhat racist, somewhat generous and loving. Belly reads very much like one of those characters you encounter in Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. Characters who are at once despicable and truly beautiful and luminous people. And the coexistence of these two sides, it's what makes them so very human. It's very difficult in narrative to represent fully human characters. Usually you have to rely on tropes, and even in a wonderful, what I personally believe to be a masterpiece, a book like Oscar Wilde, the other characters, Oscar, Lola, at the end of the day, they are a little bit larger than life, which sounds ironic when you talk about Oscar, but oh dear. They fall a little bit too neatly into a certain type of character, the strong independent woman, the nerdy, loveless kid. Not Belly. That, incidentally, is another one of the features that I really only picked up upon rereading. I think the first time I went through the book, I just saw Belly as an awful, horrible, evil woman, without really connecting with the deeper implications of her personal history, without really connecting to the incredible web of trauma that makes her the messed up human that she actually is. There is so much to say about The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. It is truly one of those books like Slaughterhouse 5, like The Keep by Jennifer Egan, that, considering its length, it's really a very short novel, packs an impossible amount of complexities and delivers a beautifully crafted, beautifully complex world that is going to change, I believe, the way you look at the world outside your window and outside your door. And it's going to stay with you forever. One thing I'll remark on, one of the very interesting things about the book, is the great distance and the obvious and blatant distance that exists between the narrator and the narrated events. Junior, in the course of the book, is a rather political man. He has no problem denouncing and talking about the great crimes of the figures in Trujillo's fascist regime and in regimes that followed Trujillo's. He has no problem condemning the crimes committed by the United States in the Dominican Republic, by the Dominican regime to its own people. But while his intents are almost documentary in nature when it comes to this, say when it comes to explaining certain events in Dominican history, elsewhere in the novel, he clearly, as a narrator, clearly takes some great liberties. What I mean is, when he talks about the life of Belly and Oscar and the other characters, he clearly describes events that he had no way of witnessing, just as if he were there. This, paradoxically, is the very opposite of the points I made before. This is not something you pick up as you reread the book. This is something that, to me, was very clear. The first time I read the book, I was like, how does this guy know what happened then? How could he possibly know? And you kind of just gave it for granted upon second and third reading. I believe that reflecting on these liberties that Junior takes in narrating these events, is crucial, because it takes us to the heart of one of the central matters when it comes to narrative art. The fact that when you're writing a novel, when you're inventing the story of certain characters, you may be setting it in a real place, you may be talking about real people, but at one point you will have to take a leap of faith and you will have to invent something that didn't really happen, and you will have to just make it up. But this making up is not a lie, is not a way of being dishonest. It's a way of stepping into the shoes and into the psyche of somebody who lived through certain events. And this is true even if you are creating fantasy. The kind of experiences your characters live in your own version of Middle-earth, say an invented reality, are experiences that people on Earth are also encountering, and you're talking about those experiences wherever you're setting your story. And this liberty that writers take, this invention, it is very dangerous, but it is also luminous, and it is salvific, and it is enlightening, and it allows us to step into other people's lives and to experience the world through their perspective and to enrich our own, well, life through theirs. Is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde the greatest novel of all times? What does that even mean? I personally believe it would be a good candidate, even though on second read some of the jokes feel a bit off, some of the passages might read a little bit as redundant, and say especially the footnotes. I feel like the footnotes feel a bit clunky, just like in Infinite Jest and other works that use this kind of paratextual excuses. At first read it feels quite original, but upon rereading it just feels like a little bit of a lazy excuse not to have to implement this information in the flow of the narrative. You just kind of take it out and link it through a footnote. I'm not a huge fan of that, at least not as much as I was in the past, but all of these, I believe, are... Sure, there are criticisms that you can move to any masterpiece, because any novel, any work of art that has the ambitions of being so original and of creating something so new from the simple material of words, it's bound to offer itself to, well, actually a lot more criticism than what I just mentioned. It is still worth your time, and I do believe that it's still one of those books that deserve to be read by any reader. Now that we've reached the end of the video, and thank you for watching it, by the way, I believe it is important to mention events that came up a few years back when Junot Díaz published an article in the New Yorker to talk about his own history of sexual abuse and the sexual abuse he was subject to as a child. And after the article published, some women came forward to accuse him of abusive and offensive behavior. At the time there were investigations, because Diaz teaches at MIT, he is on the board of the Pulitzer Prize, there were several investigations in the matter, and he was cleared of all charges. It is a complicated matter that's impossible to summarize without really in any way in a video. It's very difficult for me to talk about it because on the one hand it is clear to me that that these women were hurt. The people who accused Junot Díaz were hurt, and they definitely didn't invent what they were saying because of some kind of conspiracy. But on the other hand, Díaz was cleared by the investigations, and I do not want to talk about somebody who was disculpated by talking as if the accusations were already made him guilty. To this day, no matter how matters evolved, there are people who are not sure whether Díaz should be taught in schools, colleges, classes, etc. And I obviously understand that position. I obviously believe that these events are going to influence the way we read the book. That the toxic masculinity that is all over the place in Oscar Wilde, and that the novel itself criticizes from the inside. Do we read it differently because of these events? How couldn't we? How couldn't we be influenced by the events as they happened? The point I'm trying to make is that I think how the events relate to your reading is something you will have to decide by yourself. And if you don't want to read the book because of what happened, that seems like an incredibly legitimate position to me. I believe that readers of Oscar Wilde need to be informed about the controversies surrounding Díaz, about the accusations that were moved, how the entire situation evolved. And sure, it is painful. As a huge Junot Díaz fan, I'm the first to say that it is incredibly painful to have to confront the kind of suffering that went into that entire story. But it's important, and I think that trying to avoid confronting this difficulty and this suffering when you approach a work of art like this is not really a viable option. It would be nice to pretend to either reject it altogether or to pretend you can just appreciate it without the complexities attached to it, but I don't think it's a solution. Definitely not for me. I thought it was important to specify this, especially because in the past I've been asked by other Junot Díaz fans in the comments to my videos what I thought about the entire situation, and I always found it quite difficult to talk about such a painful topic within the span of a YouTube comment. It is difficult. It's difficult stuff to talk about, but it's important that we all talk about it, and it's the only way we reach new forms of understanding, I believe. Thank you so much for watching the video. I only touched on a few of the many stimulating elements of the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, and I'm really curious to hear what your experience of the novel was, how you read it, whether you loved it as much as I did, what your impression was. As always, I look forward to discussing all this in the comment section. And thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Skillshare, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is an online community of creators and experts in various fields, offering video classes that are very engaging, very clear, always very collaborative. There's a beautiful collaborative spirit on Skillshare, and for each of these classes, very often watchers are invited to submit maybe projects, maybe if you're taking a creative writing class, it might be a story you're working on. If you're taking an illustration class, it might be some drawings or some artworks you've created. There's a beautiful, friendly atmosphere on Skillshare that I really appreciate, and it's not just for creativity as you might think of it. A class I appreciated recently was about modern money habits. As I get old, personal finance becomes more and more fascinating to me, and this class offered by Jason Bridges offers some very interesting tips about personal finance, about how to think anew at the way you save money, at the way you handle your earnings. It's especially relevant if you're either a freelancer or some of your income comes from freelance work, but there are suggestions even for people with a old-fashioned steady income. I really recommend you check out Skillshare and its wide offer of classes. As mentioned, there's a link in the description box that will give the first 1,000 people to click on it. Thank you once more for watching the video, and bye everyone.